And with this, I'm very honored to introduce to all of you Professor Dr. Isabelle Heus, who's a pharmacist by training and with a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, toxicology, and further specialization in regulations on medicinal product development at KU Leuven, including intellectual property rights. Her LLM she obtained from the Max Planck Institute in Munich. Her research focuses on access to medicines and therapies, and Isabelle is also focused on diverse legal and regulatory aspects along the continuum of a medicinal product life cycle, from medicinal product discovery, development, approval, reimbursement, and market adoption. And she will introduce to you the latest advancements in clinical research methodologies. Topics include the use of real-world data and real-world evidence in medicinal product development and market access, patient preferences in medicinal product development and evaluations, and the challenges when defining the concept of unmet medical need. Isabelle actively participated in several collaborative projects, bilateral university industry, university nonprofit organizations, public-private partnerships of large scale, such as IMI, which is now IHI, Horizon 2020 projects. Together we joined in an Erasmus Plus project. She also joined Marie Curie project. And thus she knows very, very well how different stakeholders, notably patients and patient advocates, push this evolution in clinical research methodologies. Isabelle, thank you so much for sharing this expertise. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hilde, for this extensive introduction of myself. And I also want to add here, before I start my presentation, that is also for me an extreme honor to be here in this program of my first PhD student of my life. So I'm really happy to do this for everyone, for the I3H Institute.
Thank you.
And we will take off now with indeed the topic that I was asked to present to all of you, namely advancement of clinical research methodologies. I will start by sharing my screen. And I can do this in a minute. So, voila. Can you see my screen, actually?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Because I cannot see anyone, Hilde. If there is any question, it would be good that you just stop me and then I can answer it. Is that okay?
Agreed. Yes.
Good. So we will talk about clinical research methodologies, actually new type of research methodologies that are very important and actual in the context of clinical research. First, I would like to present myself and also my research team that works in this context. We have a research group called Regulatory Sciences. And with my PhDs and postdoctoral researchers here on the slides, we try to advance research in the context of unmet medical needs and patients' preferences in order to reveal them in different disease areas, gene therapies, cardiology, but also inflammatory disease, oncology, and mental disorders, and many others, in order to optimize healthcare decision-making. We have also research going on in the ethical and legal and social aspects, so the LC aspects of drug development, and indeed in the regulatory and HTA market access profiles, for instance, also to inform clinical decision-making. But today it's about clinical research methodologies, and I would like to start with showing you the drug life cycle, so the development of new medicinal products for people, and bring you a little bit to contextualize you a little bit where clinical research is situated. So as you know, when new medicines are developed, basic research in the lab is very important in order to test new compounds and find new targets to work on, especially in a laboratory space. And if there is a new compound that shows some activity, for instance, on cancer cells in the lab, that might be a trigger to start some animal studies. We call this preclinical research. animal studies. And if such studies are also promising in order to move further into the clinical sphere, we see a phase where such products are upscaled, manufactured for them to be able to implement in a clinical context. We talk about clinical research when we use compounds, investigational on human beings. And in that phase of research, we test the especially safety of such compounds in living human beings, but also the efficacy, namely whether the compounds work, and as well whether the compounds are produced in a good quality, so the quality. All that information from the basic research phase up to the clinical, preclinical and clinical research phase is bundled together and offered to the regulators to get regulatory approval, but also to get a reimbursement, so to go through the market access phase. And it's there that the regulators and the market access or the payers say there is a go or a no-go to enter into the market. And if so, drugs are launched on the market and indeed used in real world, in contrast to the clinical research space where the drugs are used more in a very controlled way. Drugs are launched on the market in a real world use by many people. First, only the originator drugs, but when exclusivity rights, patent rights are over, competition enters into the market, like generics and biosimilars, and many other players come on the market. This session is about the clinical research and especially clinical research methodologies, namely those that happen in the controlled clinical research phase, but also those that may happen in a more real-life setting. And when we think about clinical research methodologies, it's all about gathering data that is important to inform regulators and market access persons, but also many other decision makers. And in the early phases of the drug life cycle, we talk about preclinical data related to pharmacological aspects, toxicological data, in vitro data. In clinical research, we talk about data that is clinical, demographic data, but also data on the efficacy, the safety, lab results, imaging data, and so forth. A new and very important type of data are patient data related to the patient's perspectives, the perspectives of patients regarding the efficacy, regarding the safety, and many other things. So indeed, clinical data, when we have data on the blood pressure, on the lung function, data related to samples which are collected in clinical trials, is something which is collected in methodologies which are embedded in the clinical trials. But what we will talk here is about data related to the perspectives of patients regarding these treatment effects, regarding the lung function, regarding the quality of life of patients, how is the outcome of a trial really impacting their life, regarding remaining uncertainties, because not all aspects can be tested in clinical trials. There are remaining gaps with respect to, say, long-term safety or long-term efficacy of clinical research of drugs, and as well the risks. There might be negative outcomes detected in clinical trials, but how are patients looking at these risks? How are they perceiving these side effects, so to say? And this is something which is revealed by a new type of clinical research methodology, namely unmet medical need studies and patient preference studies. And in fact, in order to generate new medicines on the market based on evidence, and actually new medicines that are really patient-centered, is very important to also take into account these patients' preferences and unmet needs, so that actually clinicians, but also researchers and regulators can all focus their activities on that type of data and make it very patient-centered. So we will talk more about these unmet medical needs studies and patient preference studies. Just to give you a little context, our healthcare system today focus highly on the products that are offered to them by companies that create these products. And indeed, some needs and many, let's say, medical problems are solved by the problems that come by the drugs offered nowadays to the society. However, there are still remaining medical needs in our society that not always reach the developers and are known to the regulators. And that is especially what we will talk about today. And there are two frameworks that I want to present you that are, from a methodological point of view, very interesting to know more about in order to study the unmet needs and the patient preferences. The first one is the framework, the KCE need framework, namely a framework developed by the Belgian Healthcare Knowledge Center, KCE, in order to assess and identify unmet needs of patients. And the other one is the IMI Prefer framework, which is a framework to study and implement patients' preferences. Both of these frameworks are publicly available. The first one is actually published as a KCE report, also on their website available. And the other one is actually the outcome of a large European project for which recommendations have been written. And this IMI Prefer framework has also received a positive qualification from the European Medicines Agency, meaning that the European Medicines Agency, EMA, also recognizes this framework to assess patient preferences, considers this as a valuable and important framework to take into account. It is also indeed building even other regulatory guidelines, ICA-8 guidelines, based on this framework. Let's first dive into the unmet medical needs studies and more specifically the KCE need framework. In that framework, the aim is to identify and quantify unmet medical needs via a particular model to inform research, so that research within labs, within universities and others are directed towards what persons and patients need. And if that is happening, the ultimate goal is as well to inform policy making, so that, for instance, funding is directed towards research that focuses on the gaps in the health problems that patients and persons on Earth still have. So this methodology has a streamlined trajectory where, based on particular criteria, evidence, so data, is collected in order to solve and identify the unmet medical needs. Data is collected based on literature, interviews, and surveys, and a call is also launched towards the whole society who can actually raise certain unmet medical needs. What are the criteria for which data, evidence, hence, needs to be collected under the unmet medical needs study framework? So the criteria which are linked to unmet medical needs in that particular framework relate to the health needs of patients and persons, also the health care needs, namely the needs related to the available care for the moment, and also the social needs of persons, namely what is the impact on their social life. So the health needs relate to the impact and the lack of information and solutions related to their general quality of life, but also relating problems physically, psychologically, how patients and persons may live in an autonomous way or not, and as well their life expectancy. Healthcare needs means, are there treatments nowadays available? Are these treatments effective? What is the quality of the care that persons have today? Is there a burden related to the available treatments, and are the treatments accessible, yes or no? And with respect to the social needs, indeed, what is the impact of the disease on the social life of persons? Can they go to work? Can they attend educational activities? And are there huge financial consequences? For different types of diseases and indications, we want to collect data related to these aspects and hence assess whether or not there is an unmet need. KCE has developed this framework with our research group, we have optimized this for specifically for rare diseases. And when now future studies are happening with respect to unmet medical needs, the aim is to fine-tune the criteria related to this framework in line with the particular disease that you want to study, and then actually execute the data collection based on the need questionnaire, which is also publicly available and which contains validated scores, for instance, for the quality of life, but also for other particular questions. To conduct an interview because in order to contextualize the answers of persons and patients towards these particular criteria, and also to consult databases, for instance, the Global Burden of Disease database that can also contains a lot of information related to particular aspects of the burdens, hence also part of the unmet needs of persons. And this is actually the way of doing these unmet need studies. And we have, for instance, conducted such studies in different disease areas, and I will show you two examples, in fact. So the first is an unmet medical need study in the context of the Cushing syndrome. It is actually a disease where there is too much of the hormone cortisol for a long time. And it is actually a rare disease where we did such study via recruiting these patients in the clinicians at the UZ Leuven. And the other study is a rare cardiac genetic defect study, whereby persons have structural defects in their heart that also impact their life. For the Cushing syndrome, you see here a picture of such patients. And indeed, these patients suffer from fatty humps between their shoulders. They have also a very round face, and they have also high blood pressure and other symptoms. It's very difficult to reveal all these symptoms in clinical trials, so unmet medical need studies may really bring these symptoms to the front and also actually explain how such symptoms impact the quality of life of these persons. With respect to arrhythmogenic cardiomyopathy, indeed, these persons have a severe heart disease and they suffer from arrhythmia, also experience blackouts, and may even have a sudden death. So, these persons, by having these symptoms, can often also not participate in normal social life. They need to stop some sport activities. It has a lot of impact on their normal life. And that's also very important to reveal this to the society, for researchers to focus on these aspects which do not always come to the front in regular clinical trials. So we did this study, we made several engagement flyers also to ask these persons to contribute to this study. And the output of the study is indeed nowadays not put in clinicaltrial.gov databases because it's a very specific type of output. It is actually following the KCE rules made in a type of a dashboard system, where you see here an overview and an example of it, and then stored in the NEED database, which is at the moment a database governed by the KCE and CNSANO, and hence used for further use in research or policy making, as I also already explained in the first slide. So the more studies that are done, the more view we have on the needs of patients in the society. And which needs then, which unmet needs of persons are now most important? That is something which is, let's say, which can be conducted by patients' preference studies, following the PREFER framework, to which I already hinted in one of the first slides. So what are these patients' preference studies? These are studies that investigate the acceptability to patients of the most important outcomes or attributes that matter to them. So what we do in patients' preference studies is first identify what disease and treatment aspects really matter to patients, and this actually is a little bit in line with the unmet medical need studies. But we then go further and assess how much are these aspects of diseases or treatments mattering to them, and what are the trade-offs that patients make between the benefits and the risks, and how does that differ amongst different persons. I will give you an example. Here you can see a patient suffering from alopecia areata, characterized by the fact that there is hair loss at the scalp and also hair losses at the eyelashes. And this actually impacts a lot their quality of life. New medicines are in the pipeline that may indeed solve and even restore hair losses at the scalp. However, these new medicines come along with risks for blood clots or risks for cancer. Now, these patients' preference studies investigate how important a solution for their hair loss is compared to the risk that they may come along while taking this medication, risks for blood clot, for instance. And these patients' preferences will also investigate whether that the outcome differs between, for instance, females and males. So, what the heterogeneity in terms of preferences is. And how are we doing such patient preference studies? How is this going on? It starts with the qualitative phase, where based on literature, we look up a lot of information regarding the disease and the treatments. And then we follow this up by interviews or focus group discussions, depending on the question, talking really about these aspects of hair loss and quality of life and the risks related to the treatments. And following that, we select certain attributes, certain characteristics that can be quantified on a larger scale via a particular survey. There are different types of surveys that can perform preferences or reveal preferences, and some of them are here depicted. For instance, the discrete choice experiment, the DCE, or the probabilistic threshold technique, or best-worst scaling. We really want to foster these patients to take a choice into what is most important to them. Important is also that we have a clear dialogue with the stakeholders, the decision makers in the end, who need this information and who are included in an advisory board that steps in at every phase of this study. How is such survey now looking like? Here I show you a print screen of a DCE, whereby you can see that attributes are included at the left side of this survey, and attributes may relate to how long a particular cancer, for instance, how long it takes until the cancer advances when you take a medicine, or for instance, how you will take the medicine intravenously or daily, what type of side effects may occur, diarrhea, what the chance that you have a severe infection, or the chances also that you will develop organ damage and so forth. These were in this particular study the most important attributes that actually regulators or payers needed in order to take subsequent decisions. And for each attribute, we have levels. For instance, how do you take the medicine? The level is intravenously or daily. Diarrhea, either you have no diarrhea or you have a mild to moderate diarrhea for a particular period of time. Also, the chances to get severe infection also is depicted here in terms of percentages of the risk that you have. And then persons or patients are asked to choose between medication A or medication B. And this scheme or this scenario is reproduced multiple times in order to give an estimate and create weights for these particular attributes for that particular person. So indeed, these patients' preference studies are aimed to give weights to the attributes and to, in the end, give a view about the relative importance of these attributes, one versus the other. Here you see an overview of an outcome of such a patient DCE, patient preference study in the DCE, where you see that, for instance, here the life expectancy, so the months that you live extra due to the fact that you take the medicine, is most important related compared to other attributes, for instance, mobility problems or pains or vision problems or reduced energy. Another outcome of patient preference study is the minimal acceptable benefit that actually persons accept or want to have in order to accept a particular risk. For medicines that are developed, there is always a risk related to it, but also a benefit. And how much does this benefit need to be in order to accept a certain risk? Here I show you an example how this is revealed and also visualized for for particular treatments. Imagine there is a new treatment, but that comes along with an improvement of progression-free survivals expressed in the number of months that the progression-free survival is executed. However, the medicine also will create side effects. Think of diarrhea, organ damage, infections, and so forth, and also has a particular mode of administration, intravenously or orally via a pill. How much improvement in the progression-free survival is necessary to accept that there is a worsening in, for instance, diarrhea? And you see here that indeed there are, for instance, 21.6 months progression-free survival needed in order for these persons to accept a progression from no diarrhea to severe diarrhea. So this actually gives you indeed how patients normally reason when they have a medicine in front of them. And how do preferences of persons vary among different types of subpopulations, different types of people? And here you see as well an example of an outcome where you see that for persons that already take a lot of medications, life expectancy is the most important thing, whereas for persons that actually go for the first time for one type of therapy and didn't have a large track record of different types of therapy, vision problems and that you may get with respect to this therapy is extremely important, and less for those who take a lot of therapies. So this actually shows you that there is a lot of variation also in preferences, and that it is important to also reveal this and offer this to the decision makers, that there is not a one-size-fits-all outcome of such patient preference study. I want to show you as well a study that we did with respect to inflammatory bowel disease and the preferences here. And for that type of disease, IBD, in a qualitative part, we revealed multiple attributes, and ultimately we selected 14 attributes, which we could include in a DCE discrete choice experiment as follows. So we had attributes linked to the risk that these people need to have to undergo surgery. Also, the risk to develop severe psychological impacts. The way these treatments are administered, and also the speed of working of the treatment once the treatment is taken. And we included the different attributes in different scenarios, offered them to the patients. Actually, we had 15 different questions, and we piloted them with patients, translated this into different languages, and did the analysis. And what you then get is a lot of data. I will show you just one part of it as an example. But here we saw that, for instance, what is most important to patients is that we find a solution for their urgency and for the pain that they have to go to the toilet. but also for the severe daily abnormal pains and cramps that they have, and the extreme fatigue that they are suffering from when they have the disease. The fact how fast the treatment works or how the treatment is administered intravenously or via a pill is less important for these persons. And this is actually very important because these are the things where companies nowadays always focus on. Let's change our administration form from an intravenous to a pill to something else and have a new patent and have a new other medications. But yeah, what patients find most important is indeed the solutions for their still remaining problems. And then also the presence of visual signs of inflammation in the bowel. This is something which is very often measured in clinical trials. It's important, of course, but it's not the most important thing that patients really want to have been solved in the end. So it's very important to know what patients really find the most important thing. So when is it actually useful to understand patients' preferences? We have studied this in this prefer project, and we call this situations where preferences are really sensitive. So actually decisions where the preferences of the patients can be more decisive. And an example is when when there's really unclear which characteristics of diseases or which characteristics related to the products matter most to persons. If, for instance, you have a medication where the benefits are very high and the risk to take the medication is low, yeah, then it's the preferences to get the preferences of the patients for that type of medicine is less relevant because the benefits are very clear and the risks are very low. But if you have a situation where the benefits are apparently low, but the risks are very high, it is important to understand what patients think about this, how large this benefit is perceived for them, and also what type of risk they are accepting. And especially the orange and the yellow ones, the high, and when there is an intermediate decision, a low benefit with a low risk, coming very closely to each other. What is actually the balance, the trade-off that persons take? And another situation is when there are multiple treatment options and no single option is actually clearly superior to the other. And it is actually the medicine, the doctor, that needs to take a decision. Here, the doctor, the physician, really wants to know what would be the preference of the persons themselves. In this is the case at IBD. There are multiple treatments available, not always clear which treatment is better of the other, but these treatments come always with a particular side effect, and it's very important to understand which side effects or which benefits is most important to this particular patient in order to give him or her the best treatment solution. So which decisions can be informed is one thing. Which decisions are informed by unmet needs and patient preference studies is another thing. And here you see multiple actors in the context of drug development. You have the industry, the academics, the regulators that need to approve these drugs, then the payers that need to reimburse them, the physicians that prescribe these drugs, and the patients ultimately that take these drugs. And indeed, if we focus, actually all of them may take benefit from information of unmet needs of patients. The industry, in order to direct their development trajectories towards the needs of patients, but also the academics to do the research directed to what patients really need. And when you look at the regulators, here they need to do always an assessment and balancing exercise with respect to the benefits and the risks. And they do this for the European level, if it is EMA, but they really need to have a better view about this. And if we look at how regulators could, let's say, use this type of information, we can have a look at the European Public Assessment Report. This is actually a report which is publicly available about every medicine. And what you see, there is a particular section in this report which is called the benefit-risk balance, and where you see how regulators in the end actually really need to take this information and make such decisions. And there is one, let's say, section that talks about the unmet medical needs and the benefit risk assessment, and actually the importance of the favorable and unfavorable effects to persons. So if such information would be available, that could be included here in these public assessment reports. And has it ever been done? Yes. Here you see an example of an EPAR, an European Public Assessment Report, for ritlecitinib, which is in fact a medication for the disease that I talked to you about, namely alopecia areata, and where the discrete choice experiment was executed on the outcome of the clinical trial results for regulators in order to investigate what are the maximal acceptable risks for potential safety concerns in order to calculate the net benefit risk profile. And you see here that indeed the scalp regrowth and having normal eyebrows is actually very important to these persons as versus the risks of serious infections and the risks of cancers. And you see that these persons gave a very high value. These persons with severe alopecia areata gave a very high value to the scalp regrowth. And that's why the opinion of the CHMP, so the Commission, so the Committee for Human Medicinal Products at the EMA, gave a positive opinion for this medication, although it gave side effects, but these were, let's say, perceived less important than the positive benefits for this medication. And that's also important for payers, the ones who need to decide upon the reimbursement. There are different criteria that are related to the patient's social needs and the patient needs and the social needs, but also the relative clinical effectiveness, of the clinical outcomes of these medications. So this information is very important to them as well, to take patient-centered decisions. And physicians as well. There is nowadays a lot to do about shared decision making. Patients have a lot of information needs. There is information indeed sometimes available, but that is sometimes inaccessible, outdated, not always in the language of the patients. And here, patient decision aids may play a role, and patient preference studies may provide the necessary information to create patient decision aids that can help physicians to give the adequate information to patients. And I show you here a patient decision aid that we have been created in the context of IBD, so inflammatory bowel disease, where it is a web-based application where, based on the patient preference study, information is actually from patients is actually included in the tool, and also available for patients also at home to make clear decisions about what subsequent therapy they think is most important to them. It's a very interesting research domain, and research is still going on, and actually in different disease areas. So what I have been presenting here is also the work of my PhDs and postdocs, and also many collaborators in the field, whom I want to thank a lot in the context of all new interesting studies that we are conducting. And if you have any other questions, I'm very open to answer them to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Isabelle. And I still remember when it all started with this Prefer project and how much it evolved since then and how increasingly used it is and referred to, as I see well, not only by, I would say, the HTA, but definitely also by the regulators now. It's a never evolving field. And I think that the three talks of this morning really places this increasing importance of patients, not only at the end of the drug development cycle as a consumer of the product, but really as a shared decision maker in the whole drug development process. It's honestly fascinating to see what you've accomplished actually. Do we have any questions from the students? Anja, you had a question? Yeah, you can definitely ask it. You're on mute still, but it's more, well, I will,
Can
Anja,
you
let
hear me now?
you explain. Yeah,
Yeah.
we hear
Yeah.
you. Yes.
I want to know what are some of the strategies to recruit patients actually to do these assessments. Because as I understand, one of the challenges, especially to do clinical trials, is to actually get the patients on board to do all this. And yeah, so how all evolves like in the context of doing the unmet needs
Yeah.
studies or the patient preference studies.
Yeah. That's a very important point and very interesting thing, and actually a research on itself. I experience recruitment of participants for these studies. So we have, first of all, a very close collaboration with the clinicians, and always it goes via. So we have one way is always via the clinicians that we collaborate with. And then another way is via the patient organizations that we collaborate with. So for every disease, we then look up which are the patient organizations that are out there. And then another strategy is via certain other clinics. So the clinics of in other countries, for instance, clinical hospitals, and yeah, so this is another thing, and sometimes it is via the specific, let's say, organizations that have close contact with persons. For instance, we are doing also study with in smoking disease for to stop smoking, and then we need to work with tabacologen and tabacologists, or with sometimes wijkgezondheidscentra. I don't. So it's like these houses where
Community centers,
they're
community
vulnerable.
health centers.
Yeah,
Yes.
voilà, community services that have access to, because it's important in these studies to not only reach the ones who are easily reachable, but to have the vulnerable people there. And that is actually, that requires a lot of, let's say, strategic thinking, how you reach them in order to first identify who are the most vulnerable groups, and how can you reach them, but also who needs to reach them. And this is really depending on the type of study and disease that you do. For instance, we work also on a disease which is a psychotic disorder. So that's actually a very complicated disease, because these people think that they are not sick. And if you then approach them and saying you want to participate in our study which is related to your disease, yeah, they say, I have no disease. So that's why it really asks a lot of, let's say, a preparation. And so, but this is mainly via, diverse channels. It's not always just one, and it's not a marketing. You cannot just go via for some surveys you go via, let's say, these um, um, consultancy type of companies that have a market reach of, and they have in their portfolio people that they can reach. This is absolutely not at all possible for these type of studies. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. I also
Yeah.
have another question. I don't know if somebody else has another question, but
Yeah.
You can
yeah,
go.
can I go? Okay, so for the alopecia, I saw that it was a 3 years, let's say, following up if they have like cancer or for the
Yeah.
cancer risk. But what happened like after the 3 years? Because cancer risk is kind of like very very engaging, and I don't think that somebody would want to participate in a drug that can possibly have cancer risk. So what happens like after these assessments of 3 years is finished?
Yeah. So this is actually the point is actually that there is a trial conducted to assess the safety and the side effects of this medication.
Mm-hmm.
And the trial cannot last forever. So a
Yeah.
trial has always a particular length. And in
Yeah.
this case, the data that was offered to EMA was
Mm-hmm.
a trial that actually revealed that the probability to get scalp regrow was
Mm-hmm.
for hair growth was 80 to 100%. So actually there was a quasi 100% or 90% chance that the hairs which were lost would regrow. But in their study, they did a 3-year follow-up to get a
Mm-hmm.
serious infection or to get cancer. They did not
Yeah.
do this for 7 or 8 or 10 years. So indeed,
Mm-hmm.
what happens after 4 or 5 or 6 years is not known, not studied in this study. And
Mm-hmm.
this is actually a very important point, what you say, because
Yeah.
this is actually an element of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And actually, how much uncertainty are the patients accepting um,
Yeah.
for accepting this treatment? And in this case, they actually accepted the uncertainty. They were already happy with this, with the percentage of risk that they see. That actually it is only studied for 3 years.
Yeah.
If the hair grows, it's for them, let's say, convincing enough. So that's indeed also very important, and that's why how you see also how patients and thinking take this uncertainty risk or
Mm-hmm.
this uncertainty parameter within their decision making. Because otherwise, the regulator would there be and say, okay, but it's only 3 years. Maybe the patients do not think they will never ever take this medication. But indeed, even if you show the just 3-year data of this risk, the patients preferred the drug.
Yeah.
No.
Thank you. I also had the last question, but it was more related also to the previous speaker when they presented like the general electronic health data from Europe, that you collect data and then you can other let's say companies or people can use them to generate like different studies or do different assessments. And my question would be like, is this health electronic health data also used for example, for drug repurposing? Because I know that a lot of companies they would like to have some data to, for example, try to put again a drug in the market for a different disease that might also work.
But I'm not sure, Hilde, is the previous
Yeah.
speaker still there?
No, she's
Yes.
not. But potentially, if you don't know the answer, we can definitely go back to Tatiana on the
Yeah.
21st of March. But potentially, you say, I have already an ID.
Yeah, no, indeed, this is absolutely a very important point that you say. So that is actually also a type of a second use
Yeah.
that can be offered. It always needs to be then indeed again, let's say, assessed. But that's absolutely very important, let's say, avenues, and that's also where they do it for. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say
Thank you.
maybe to add to that, and Isabel, correct me if I'm wrong, but in any case, Anja, the data that is accompanying the clinical trial and the post-marketing surveillance is also under protection. It's really protected. So the company itself, the originator of the trials, of the data
Mhm.
collection, can potentially reuse it if this was included in the, I would say, electronic form, informed consent. However, just transferring the data to another company is not possible. There's really protection there. On the other hand, for drug repurposing, after the exclusivity period ends, then this data, clinical data, becomes available. And for example, this can be used to shorten the phase 1 on toxicity. So the safety and toxicity data is being used, and this is the benefit of drug repurposing, that you can really shorten this time frame for clinical development. On the other hand, the personal data there, we are protected with what we share. So you will most likely, I would say, have to go back to be able to use this data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Isabella,
you.
I also actually have a question. Who pays for these studies? I would say the clinical trial sponsor. Fine, if it's pharma, they pay for this
Yeah.
patient preference study. I can imagine that they think like yet another cost that we need to bear. But what
Yeah.
happens if the clinical trial is an investigator-driven hospital clinical trial, a
Yeah.
university hospital? Who then bears these costs? Because university hospitals don't have the cost, I can
No.
imagine, the funding.
Yeah. No, that's actually ultimate nowadays. These studies are indeed. It's not that the regulator asks for these studies and then offers, for instance, funding for academia or so to do these studies. So that's not the situation actually for the moment. Also not for the payers or others. Actually, what you see is, yeah, we work like with the regular channels. If we as researchers at the moment look for if there is, for instance, if you have a national funding for a particular project and you think it out and you submit this, that's actually that the researchers by themselves create or ask for competitive funding for this, or sometimes Europe or have calls which focus on this. So it is the case that nowadays you now and then see calls for unmet medical needs or even patients' preferences. And for now, in my research, it's actually via these ways that we do these research. You can also sometimes have a collaboration with a company for this. That because they know that they need this data for a particular product, but that is still at the moment a little bit challenging because it's not sure whether it is needed, because it's like the chicken and the egg. Like, yeah, if the first there need to be a lot of data, and then the regulators will look at this and so forth. So at the moment, we are not yet in we are, let's say, in an area where regulators are not always asking this explicitly, and this creates that companies not always fund this because regulators don't ask it explicitly. It may change in the future. That's a bit the situation. So it's indeed, from a funding point of view, I find it also difficult to do this. It's not that expensive compared to a clinical trial. It's not millions or euros or so. So that's not the case. But you never know what the costs will be in the end. Sometimes it's more difficult than you expect. And yeah.
I can
And
imagine that's like clinical or big pharmaceutical companies conducting clinical trials, relying on the
yeah,
expertise of CROs, that such types of companies, if it would be
yeah,
moving towards being obligatory to, in
yeah,
parallel with the clinical trial, do patient preference studies,
yeah,
that CROs have a subdivision or
yeah,
separate companies,
yeah,
as we know that there are some players in the
yeah,
field really see this as a business, because patient data is a business,
yeah.
not only clinical data, but as you rightfully explained, definitely also preference data. So I think that this might pop up more and more, no?
I thought this also, and there was a moment that I was thinking, oh yes, this will now be completely commercialized, so to say. But that is not what I am seeing now around me. And maybe this is due to the fact that, yeah, you need to have access to these patients. And it takes a lot of time. It is not a quick win.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes really a lot of time, and then you need it very thoroughly and so forth. And I'm not sure whether in the consultancy atmosphere nowadays there is always the time to take the time for the patient. And also, I'm not not always sure whether then the company, whether physicians are so keen with always with always going with a consultancy company. So it's, as you say, I thought this initially also, but it's not what I'm seeing. But okay, but it can maybe change in the future. Um,
I have
yeah.
maybe a last question. If no students pop up or give some questions in the chat, I will maybe ask a last question. With respect to the questions raised about whether patients are willing to pay for it, well, then how do you approach this in the study? Because well, what I often feel is that patients have no clue about the real cost of a
Mhm.
drug or of a therapy to the society, and that indeed they pay for part of the cost of their medication or of their overall treatment, but that a lot of financial burden is bared by the society. So
Indeed.
how do you explain this?
Yeah.
Okay, I am willing to pay that amount of money if I extend my
Yeah.
life with 2 years. However, I don't really pay that money, so I have no clue.
Yeah, but that's also, I think, not the purpose of such patient preference study per se. That we want to know whether they pay for it, because actually in Belgium they don't pay for this.
No?
So, for instance, for all these therapies for IBD, for instance, or for these gene therapies or whatever, Belgian patients don't pay for this. It is different in the US and it's different in some other countries, but in Belgium, the financial consequences are not for, and that is also not what we are then interested in. But we are what is interesting for the payer is to know how these patients perceive the side effects and the effects. And that is something that patients can reveal. If patients say, oh, this is a huge, this effect would really dramatically, in a positive way, change my life, and this side effect is completely acceptable with this effect or unacceptable, this is something for the payer then to take into many other factors that they take into account to decide upon reimbursement. And one of these things is also what is the budget impact. So the payer will, the company will then ask a particular price. Okay, so you have the patients, you have the outcome of the trial. You know also from the preference study the importance to patients of the outcome. Here we have the available budget. And that's actually an exercise that the payer needs to make. And we don't ask the persons or the patients whether they would pay for this. I am also not sure whether they even think of whether our society would pay for this. But if you would put a certain thing in the DCE about the costs, indeed, then yes. But most of the time, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
So
Okay, no, I can imagine with our.
it's a criterion within for the payers to take with them, actually. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. And indeed, with our social healthcare system based on solidarity, it indeed might make no sense, but indeed, there are different systems. On the other hand, of course, we know the system is completely different in the US, and that
Yeah.
potentially, I don't know how much patient preference studies are being conducted in
Well,
US.
this study that I just presented about the IBD, so the inflammatory bowel disease, is now conducted in Europe. So my PhD is finishing the results, and I showed you a preview about what these patients find important. There was no element in it related to costs in these 14 attributes. So all were related to the disease characteristics and the treatment. But my PhD student went to a congress and there was a company, there is now an interest to do the same study in the US. So actually launch the survey in the US, but I am thinking maybe there I need to include a cost thing, because we need to understand whether they need to pay there really. And then I'm curious how the results will change. So we did
Absolutely.
not do for the moment yet a study that includes the US actually. That's much, but I think it is very important to also do this and see how the preference would change in that context.
Yeah, and I think indeed with the difference between Medicare and Medicaid, you have a different
Yeah,
audience to target, and you already have an additional burden to conduct this study that you must make sure that you have the right audience and
yeah,
participants in your study to make a really an informed advice for informed decision making in the end. Yeah, indeed, very interesting. And I'm also happy, I'm conscious of time. I'm also very happy that you indeed already introduced, I would say, our first speaker in the afternoon, who will actually talk about budget health impact. So then we will really go into the payers' considerations when or not to reimburse something, at what cost. And I'm, I'm really I'm really looking forward to that. And I really honestly would like to thank you, Isabel, for sharing your expertise and all the evolutions in this very fascinating and highly needed research domain. Thank you so much.
thank you, and we see each other soon back. Bye
Yes,
bye.
absolutely. And we see each other all soon. Well, at 2 p.m. we reconvene. Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
Isabel.
Bye.